Welcome to another episode of Living Justice, Living Leadership. I'm your host, Lee Fisher, Dean of Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University. You know, I've had the great privilege to live my life at the intersection of the public, private, nonprofit, and academic worlds. As a lawyer, CEO of 2 nonprofit organizations, and as a state legislator, attorney general, and lieutenant governor. And the lessons I've learned come down to just 2 words: justice and leadership. That's why every week we'll talk to people who are walking the walk. Some are lawyers and some are not, but all of them have something in common. They are change makers. They are guardians of justice. They are living justice, and they are living leadership. Welcome to another podcast, and we're going to be hearing this week from Jim and Nancy Petro. In our first episode, we heard about how Jim Petro, who served as Attorney General of Ohio and State Auditor of Ohio and the Chancellor of the University System, first entered public service. How he and his wife Nancy first met at Denison University. And today we're going to be talking about an extraordinary book that they wrote together. It's known as False Justice, the 8 Myths That Convict the Innocent. We're going to hear about an extraordinary case of Clarence Elkins that led to them devoting the next 10 years of their life to exposing the fact that there are thousands of wrongful convictions in America. You don't want to miss this episode. There's some fascinating stories. Let's talk now about the issue that both of you are perhaps best known for, at least over the last 10 years, and that is a great book that you both wrote together, False Justice, 8 Myths That Convict the Innocent. First of all, I think it's fair to say, whether it's fair or not, that people don't expect Republicans to write a book about criminal justice. It's usually, if we do the stereotype, it's done by Democrats. So talk about how you got involved in this issue and what the book is all about.
We encountered wrongful conviction. You know, the whole concept that somebody went to prison for 6 years, 10 years, and this is my working with the Innocence Project and with other things. But we discovered that, yeah, there are people who are wrongfully convicted and they go to prison for life. There's no doubt there have been people executed wrongfully. All of those things point to errors in the system. And one day, Nancy, who'd been researching this and reading about it, she said, you know, we're going to write a book about wrongful conviction. The reality is I don't write well. I speak pretty well, but I don't write well. Nancy writes very well. She's a talented writer. And so she wrote the book, but I get my name on it. That's kind of a good deal. But she has the talent in that side. And literally the book was quite popular. It still remains popular. False Justice, 8 Myths That Convict the Innocent. And it talks about why mistakes occur and what we can do as a society about avoiding them.
Jim, go ahead, Nancy, go ahead.
Well, by the grace of God, I would not believe this. I would believe that our criminal justice system doesn't make mistakes. When Jim was Attorney General, he was contacted by Mark Godsey of the Ohio Innocence Project and Bill Seitz. I think he was a senator.
Yeah,
at
Bill
that time.
Seitz was senator. You knew Bill.
I know Bill.
Mm-hmm. They introduced Jim to the Clarence Elkins case. And this was a guy, never had a criminal record and was convicted, in fact, pursued within hours of a very heinous crime in which his mother-in-law was viciously murdered and raped, and his 6-year-old niece was raped and left for dead. It was a horrific crime, and he was arrested within hours, even though he lived like 45 minutes away, I think, quite a drive away. And he was eventually convicted on almost nothing. It was actually the eyewitness of the 6-year-old girl who was brutally assaulted in the dark of night.
Oh my God.
And she said, well, the man, when pressed, looked like my uncle Clarence, and they took that as was my uncle Clarence. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And his wife, Melinda, it was her mother who had been murdered. It was her niece, and so who had been raped. And so she made it her mission, although a mother of 2 boys, to free her husband, who she knew was innocent, and find the real killer. And that story just really shook me up because, of course, we didn't know how it was going to end. And it became very clear, even with DNA, that he did not do it. But it was very difficult to get the prosecutor to acknowledge it.
Now, I was the Attorney General at the time.
Okay.
And folks from the Innocent Project came to me and said, we were told you're a pretty fair-minded guy. Here's the evidence. I mean, we've got DNA evidence that shows at the crime scene that shows another perpetrator. And that perpetrator now we've discovered we had a match.
A little bit later, we got that match.
Yeah, there was a match of a guy who's in prison at the state penitentiary near Bucyrus.
Oh, and by the way, he lived 3 doors down from the crime.
Oh, my God.
He had just come out of prison after other serious felonies, and he was living 3 doors away.
Was he ever a suspect in the case?
No.
No.
The only suspect that the prosecutor ever came up with.
I mean, again, they arrested Clarence literally within hours.
Incredibly sloppy police work, it sounds like.
Well, and they ended up paying for it,
Yes.
later, way down the road.
Way down the road, millions of dollars.
Yeah.
It was a mistake.
Wow.
But I was convinced then by the information that Mark Gotze from the Ohio Innocence Project brought to me. And, it was, I think somebody had said to him, well, you ought to go see the Attorney General. He's a fair-minded guy. And if you've got an argument, he'll want to hear about it because the notion of injustice is something he's not going to be very comfortable with. And that kind of is what happened.
And the ultimate resolution of that case was what?
Eventually that DNA, which, by the way, there was DNA available at the trial, but it wasn't, DNA was not as conclusive at that point, and people would easily say, well, it doesn't necessarily. Well, eventually the rape kit DNA in both of those victims' cases excluded Clarence. And then it's a story that it's unbelievable. Melinda read an article that made her suspect Earl Mann, who had lived 3 doors down. Mm-hmm. And she at the same time, he was back in prison again. He was transferred into the same cell block as Clarence, which is
my God.
With 50,000 prisoners. It's unbelievable. And so she urged Clarence to do the risky thing of trying to get the guy's DNA, which eventually he did on a cigarette butt. They sent it to the lab, and guess what? It was a direct match.
Perfect match.
To the rape kit and everything.
So in some ways, Clarence Elkins solved his own case.
He did.
Yes.
He did, along with his former
the
wife.
2 of them did what in this case, law enforcement had failed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Did the murderer, the neighbor, ever confess?
Yes.
Yes.
This is a life-changing event, not just for Clarence Elkin, but for the Petros, because it prompted you to do something different. Right.
When I first had this conversation, and I don't know if you know Jim Canepa, he was my criminal justice director at the time. Mm-hmm. And so he'd gotten involved in it. He'd gotten to spend some time talking to Mark Gotze, who was head of the Ohio Innocence Project. And very early on, he came to me, I'm the AG, and says, we got to look into this. I think this guy's innocent.
Well, yeah, you gave it to him and told him to look into it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, it became a cause, obviously objected to by the prosecuting attorney of the county. And it was an interesting time because I never thought something like that could really happen. A person have spent, 10 years in prison, convicted of a murder they had nothing to do with. It was really kind of a whole new learning experience.
So let's talk about some of these myths that you wrote about. What are some of the 8 myths?
Talk about the myths.
Eyewitness is the best testimony. Untrue. Everyone in prison claims innocence. Not true. Really, it's a very small percentage that continue to say they're innocent. And you should listen to them if they do that, because they have to pay a price usually. If people confess, they must be guilty. Not true. False confession is, where you learn all of these. You learn it by studying cases of exoneration.
Yes.
And now we are honored to serve on the National Registry of Exonerations, which is a project that's been around for, maybe 15, 20 years. But it is a collection of all known exonerations in the country. And there are now, well over 2,000 of these, actually 2,802 as of today. It's a very dynamic number. But what's amazing about these is over 1,000 of these people were convicted of murder. And so it's a very small subset of cases in which an army of pro bono attorneys and innocence projects listen to someone who says they're innocent and then have to go back, reinvestigate, and prove innocence, which is a lot harder than proving guilt. And so then those cases are available there to analyze. And we learned so much about how these myths are supported when you look at the past cases.
A lot of people have trouble understanding why someone would confess to a crime they didn't commit. Tell us the circumstances under which that happens.
Do you want to do it?
I'm going to have Nancy do it. Her voice is a little better than mine is today. I think that the simple answer is that they confess because they have no other way out. They don't know what's happening to them. Mm-hmm. They begin to think, well, okay, they're making me a deal, and I might get the death penalty, or I might go to prison for the rest of my life. I need to solve this, and then becomes something where they say, well, okay, I'll sign that. I'll sign that confession.
And it's also sometimes relief from intense and unfair interrogation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that could be true.
Mm-hmm.
We used to think it was just all physical intimidation, but it's psychological. One of the big things is, and it's only been corrected, it's maybe going to be corrected or has been, I think, in Illinois. Police officers are allowed to lie to, the suspect about the evidence they have. And what that does is convince the person that I'm going to be convicted. Somehow they have, it's not true. My fingerprints couldn't be there, but they say they have them. I don't know how that happened. I'm going to be convicted. And at that point, you go from a search for justice to a negotiation. And the negotiation is scary. If you go to trial and lose, you're going to get 30 years. Or you can plead out and you'll get 3 years or 5 or 10. And it's a horrific circumstance to be in. And the vulnerable, are young people that may be under substance abuse or whatever, or just people that are naive about the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. And Lee, I just want to say that you cannot study wrongful conviction and not come to the conclusion that we shouldn't have a death penalty. I know you and Jim, you did an op-ed on that.
Yes.
And there's nothing that brings that home more than to recognize how many people have come close to execution before they were exonerated. They had nothing to do with the crime.
Jim and Nancy, in addition to abolishing the death penalty, are there other changes in state or federal law that still have yet to be enacted, that should be enacted to deal with this issue?
The one thing I would say is we've seen it arise more and more, but access to evidence that may be kind of brushed aside by the prosecution, but what we discovered in many cases, it can be what appears to be very weak evidence that suddenly becomes very compelling evidence, and you wouldn't have expected that outcome. Mm-hmm. So you have to take every case seriously, and if there's an individual who is insistent about their innocence, don't brush it aside. The whole notion of everybody in prison claims innocence, that's not true. Someone who's really sticking to it and talking about why they're innocent should be listened to. It's prosecutors, I think, have had a traditional attitude like, well, everybody's going to tell me they're innocent, even when they're not. That's not always the case.
I think that there's, reason for reform at almost every step of the process in criminal justice.
Is there?
We mentioned one, that you shouldn't be able to, policemen, in interrogation, police persons should not be able to lie about the evidence they have, because it really makes it difficult for the defendant to not cave to an offer, and then they have a criminal record. And this can start really down the chain, not even violent felonies, and pretty soon they've got a record, and then they're kind of a go-to person when something else happens in the community. So it's very important that people get a fair opportunity and not feel forced to confess or take a plea deal.
It's an interesting note. When I began working on some innocence cases and more all around the state, Cuyahoga County, Franklin County, one of the things that became apparent is someone who's ultimately innocent pled guilty, and that's why they were convicted. And you'd ask them, why did you plead guilty? And they'd say, I just didn't think I had any choice. Everything was happening to me. My lawyer made it clear that if I go to trial, I'm going to get 20 years. If I plead guilty, I'm going to get 3 or 5. And suddenly it looked to be the only outcome that could be, favorable to me is to plead guilty. And that's tragic. That's a real tragedy in the system.
How much of this involves racial discrimination?
I think there's no doubt that, first of all, eyewitness identification of people being identified by a witness who is of a different race, that automatically can become somewhat problematic.
Yes.
A person who's identifying an alleged perpetrator, who's let's say, just as an example, a white person, and they're identifying from a lineup one of several Black people, that's not very conclusive or effective evidence, because candidly, people of a different race might not always get it right as to who is who in an identification process. And so those are a number of issues you learn that point to the fact that the evidence that convicted individuals in prison for life doesn't necessarily look very strong when you really get back and kind of look at it.
I think the exonerations are the best lens to see the bias, because actually the National Registry came out with a report this month that they've surpassed now 25,000 years of lost time to people who were innocent but convicted and served time. And if you look at those exonerees, African Americans are maybe 15% or so of the populace. They were well over half of those exonerated, meaning they were incorrectly arrested, indicted, convicted, and sentenced. And the inequities you can see them all along the way, again, in sentencing, for example, so it's tragic.
Where is Clarence Elkins today? Clarence is, living his life.
Clarence,
he's a talented man.
Well,
Tell about that.
Well, you're talking about, I think, Dean too.
I'm talking about Dean.
The two main cases in the book are Clarence Elkins. There are actually 3 Ohio cases that touched him, and one is Dean Gillespie. I think the way to think about this is they are really embracing their freedom, They've restarted their lives. They're happy on a personal level, but they're still, you don't just walk away from this. You still have lingering issues. Sometimes they're physical, sometimes they're emotional. Post-traumatic stress syndrome is very common. among exonerees. Seeking to get compensation is not, more than half never get a penny. So again, the need for reform at every level here, including support, is really lacking for these people who have had perhaps the worst trauma and the worst injustice anyone can suffer.
Have you received or experienced any backlash from people who view your position as being, quote, soft on crime?
I would say yes. I've had people, particularly in the justice system on the prosecution side, say, what the heck are you doing? You used to be Attorney General. I mean, how can you be looking at this case and taking a man convicted and claiming that he's now innocent? So yes, I've gone through that actually quite a few times. And so
have you
to actually get engaged in that, where someone's been convicted and the prosecutor insists he's got the right guy, and you're looking at this with other evidence, coming to believe that in fact this individual might be likely innocent, you do make a few enemies when that occurs, especially if you've been a former prosecutor.
Well, I want to acknowledge that as a Democrat, that I think it takes far more courage as a Republican to take the position you have taken than it would be for a Democrat. It's stereotypical, but it's true. And so I admire you both all the more, given your conservative Republican views on many issues, that you had the courage to go what might be regarded as the convention or the conservative convention. Having said that, however, there does appear to have been some meeting of the minds in recent years between the two parties on these issues, and that I've seen one of the few bright spots in an otherwise dysfunctional, hyper-partisan, mean-spirited political world today. So, and I think that is a bright spot. And so how do you explain the fact that even during the Trump era, where there was so much division, Republicans and Democrats seem to come together on these issues a little bit more?
Well, on criminal justice issues, I think it's become more and more apparent that the system has not been perfect. Even people who are part of the system, prosecutors, Republicans, as you might say, who've been advocates for a tough on crime approach, they come to realize that the system is not 100% accurate. There are mistakes made. And that's in part what the Innocence Projects around the country have really fostered, a new awareness of a risk that someone who's been convicted really is not guilty of that crime.
I think it's that. And I also think that, frankly, smartphones have changed the world.
Yes.
Because, communities are able to capture what they see, the interactions in there. And when we learn a little bit how policing works, for example, we've had that issue this year, especially. And, I think more and more people really do believe that justice should be fair and equal. And so those two issues have come together. And it's encouraging to me that one of the big trends is that prosecutors have created conviction integrity units within their offices. In fact, 6 states have them statewide. And these are finally a body where you can bring a case that has a credible claim of innocence and have it reinvestigated and, have a recommendation come out of that. And so what we've seen with exonerations, we still have this force, which is the Innocence Network, but it's been joined by more and more prosecutors who are bringing forth people they believe they've been wrongfully convicted and incarcerated.
In the final minutes of our podcast, I'm going to ask each of you a lesson learned question, particularly for those young people who are watching this podcast today. Jim, my question to you is, if you could have just 1 or 2 lessons that you've learned from a life in public service, what they would be. And Nancy, I'm going to ask you if you could also talk about lessons that you've learned from a life in public service, a different kind of public service, but nonetheless, you've had public service as well. I'd love to know what those lessons are. So, Jim, I'll put you on the spot first. What are the lessons you've learned in your life?
I will tell you that there are no absolutes. And that became apparent to me over the years, both in criminal justice, in fairness and advocacy, in adoption of new remedies, new laws. Everything has got its own measure of fragility, and there's nothing that will be the perfect outcome. But the important role of those in public service is to recognize that and strive to make wrongs right.
That's great.
About the best you can do.
Nancy, your thoughts?
Okay, mine is that you should always question your assumptions. Don't just ask what you believe and become a strong advocate. Ask yourself why you believe it and where did that belief come from. And I had to do that with wrongful conviction. It shook the foundations of my understanding what our criminal justice system was. And ultimately, it taught me how to look at everything. And so my conclusion is, I know just about nothing about everything. Probably the only thing I know a little bit about now, after 10 or 12 years of study, is wrongful criminal conviction. And it taught me that I don't know much about anything else, because it took 12 years to kind of understand that.
I think one of the great lessons of the lives that you have both lived, and it's a lesson that I think is more timely than ever before, is that too many of us in life, and particularly in politics, take the absolute positions, that we don't see the shades of gray. We only see the black and white, the right, the wrong, the yes, the no, the for and against. And we don't realize that often if we just took a little bit more time, listened to each other and tried to get into each other's heads and listen to each other's perspectives, that we would learn that maybe we're not absolutely right, maybe we're not absolutely wrong, and that there's much more room for agreement. And I think the two of you, if you have many legacies, but if that may be your greatest legacy, that you have taught many people that there are no absolutes, and that if we simply would listen to each other more, we may be able to find ways not just to compromise, but to actually come up with more effective solutions. And you're great examples of that. So I want to thank you for the lessons you've left with us and your lives of public service. Anything else you'd like to say before we close the podcast today?
I would like to say what a pleasure it's been knowing you for all of these years. You've really had the level of advocacy that's been important for both sides, Republicans and Democrats. You've served with distinction. I'm delighted that you finally became something other than a politician. You're now, the dean of a law school. I mean, what could be better?
I would argue, Jim, that every position is political, including dean of a law school. Nancy, any other final words you have?
Just thank you, Lee, for sort of pressing me to be involved with this today. And it's a pleasure. And I've always had the deepest respect for you. And we're honored to do this today.
Peggy sends her best to both of you, and thank you. And you've made it very clear to me today that of all the things we've talked about, your highest priority in life are your grandchildren, which is why we've decided to end this podcast now, because you told me it could only be an hour because you've got 5 grandchildren you need to pay attention to, and I respect that. So thank you again, Jim and Nancy Petro, for being my guests today, and thank you for your leadership and lives of public service. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.